Imagine a nation that has been sanctioned, bombed, isolated, and threatened for decades, and yet, on the 36th day of a war launched against it by the most powerful military in the world, is still standing, still fighting, and still controlling the most critical waterway on earth. This is not a hypothetical. This is what happened.
One on February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched what was called Operation Epic Fury, one of the most massive coordinated air campaigns since the Second World War. Nuclear sites were targeted, leadership compounds were struck. The American president declared that the Iranian regime should fall. The world held its breath, bracing for a swift, decisive campaign. Military analysts predicted it would last weeks, perhaps less. Markets calculated a short disruption. Western governments prepared statements of cautious support. 36 days later, the Strait of Hormuz is nearly shut. Global oil shipping is down nearly 90%. An American F-15 has been shot down over Iranian airspace. The war's stated goals have shifted not once, not twice, but at least 7 times. And the most powerful military in the world finds itself in what strategic analysts are beginning to call an escalation trap, unable to win, unwilling to leave, and facing a choke point that could strangle the global economy if held for even a few more weeks.
How did this happen? How did a war that was supposed to end in days is still going on? And it turned out to be the most disastrous military campaign of the modern era. And most importantly, is this was the Iran's plan all along? The answer will disturb you. To understand what is happening today, you have to understand what Iran was building for the past 20 years. Not nuclear bombs, not ballistic missiles, but something far more dangerous: patience.
Since the early 2000s, the Islamic Republic has operated under a single strategic doctrine, the doctrine of strategic depth. Rather than matching American conventional power, which it could never do, Iran built a web of proxy militias stretching from Lebanon through Syria into Iraq and Yemen, a web of asymmetric naval capabilities designed specifically for the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, a web of underground infrastructure, hardened, dispersed, and in many cases dug so deep into Iranian mountains that no conventional bomb could reach them, and a web of economic leverage, positioned around the 21-mile wide choke point through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day. The Strait of Hormuz is the most strategically important body of water on Earth, not because of its size, not because of its beauty, but because of what flows through it. Every major oil producer in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, depends on it to export their crude. Every major economy in Europe and Asia depends on it to receive energy. The United States, regardless of its own domestic energy production, is deeply tied to the global oil pricing system that runs through those narrow waters. Iran has known this for decades. Iranian military doctrine did not simply acknowledge the strait as a defensive asset. It transformed the strait into the central piece of a long-prepared strategic trap. For years, Iran positioned anti-ship missile batteries, fast attack boat squadrons, underwater mine-laying capabilities, and coastal defense systems along its shores of the strait. It wasn't building a wall. It was building a door, one that only Iran could lock.
When Operation Epic Fury began on February 28th, Iran did not hesitate, it activated.
Day 1 was catastrophic in its immediacy. American and Israeli aircraft struck with a ferocity that shocked even veterans of Middle Eastern conflicts. Leadership compounds, nuclear enrichment facilities, air defense headquarters, and military infrastructure across Iran were hit in simultaneous waves. The targeting was surgical in intent, overwhelming in scale. President Trump appeared before the world and declared that the regime should fall. He predicted the operation would be brief. He spoke of success as though it had already arrived. Iran's immediate public response was fury. The government called it an act of war. The supreme leadership issued declarations of resistance. But behind the declarations, something more deliberate was happening. Iran was not scrambling. Iran was executing. By day 2, Iranian ballistic missiles had already been fired toward American military bases scattered across the region. Both states entered defensive postures. The regional architecture that American diplomacy had spent years constructing began to show fracture lines. By day 4, something far more consequential occurred. Iran began its operations in the Strait of Hormuz. Not a full closure, not yet, but a demonstration. Fast boats, harassment of tanker traffic, positioning of naval assets in ways that made shipping insurance rates spike overnight. Oil markets convulsed. The price of a barrel of crude jumped in ways that hadn't been seen since the worst days of previous Gulf crises. And Trump, appearing confident, said the United States controlled the escalation. He was wrong. And deep inside the war rooms of Tehran, they knew it. By day 5, Iran's proxy network had been activated across the region. Houthi forces in Yemen, Iraqi militias, and Hezbollah-affiliated groups in Syria and Lebanon all began targeting American and allied military installations. This was not improvisation. This was a pre-scripted playbook, horizontal escalation. Rather than fighting the United States on a single front where American firepower superiority would be decisive, Iran opened multiple fronts simultaneously. Every new front stretched American attention, American logistics, and American political will a little thinner.
By the day 7, what Trump said the war would be over in weeks had become something entirely else.
For there is a concept in military theory called the strategic trap. It occurs when a more powerful force is drawn into a conflict shaped entirely by a weaker adversary, a conflict where the stronger party's conventional advantages are neutralized and the weaker party's asymmetric strengths become decisive. The Vietnam War was a strategic trap. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was a strategic trap. Iraq in 2003 became a strategic trap. Iran spent decades studying every one of those conflicts. The Islamic Republic's strategy was never to win a conventional war against the United States. It was to make winning one impossible. It was to ensure that any American military campaign against Iran would cost more than any American president could politically afford, in blood, in treasure, in global economic disruption, and in strategic coherence. The Hormuz Gambit sits at the center of this strategy. Iran understands something about the modern global economy that is rarely discussed openly. The United States cannot simply bomb its way to a resolution in the Gulf. Every day the strait remains contested. Every day shipping companies reroute tankers around the Cape of Good Hope, or simply refuse to send them at all. The economic damage compounds. Allies in Europe begin calling Washington. Asian economies dependent on Gulf oil begin recalculating their strategic alignments. The political cost of the war escalates far beyond the battlefield. Iran also understood the American political landscape with extraordinary precision. They had watched Trump operate for years. They understood that his political brand was built on strength, on deals, on quick victories. A prolonged, expensive, inconclusive war is the one thing that most threatens that brand. And so Iran's strategy was not to defeat the United States militarily. It was to outlast the American political will to fight, to make the war long, costly, confusing, and impossible to declare one. The shifting of Trump's stated war goals tells the entire story. On day 1, the objective was regime change. Within 2 weeks, that objective had quietly been abandoned and replaced with destroying Iran's nuclear program. When Iranian operations continued despite heavy strikes, the stated goal shifted again to crippling Iran's military, then to protecting global shipping, then to economic pressure, then, almost incredibly, to a negotiated settlement. Each shift was a concession. Each concession was a data point that confirmed Iran's strategic calculus was correct.
Tehran was watching every shift closely because every time the goalpost moves, Iran resolves hardened because every shift told them the same thing that America is looking for a way out.
5. The escalation ladder in this conflict did not follow the orderly progression that military theorists draw in textbooks. It lurched. It accelerated in some dimensions while stalling in others. It created feedback loops that neither side fully controlled. By day 15, it was clear that the war was not ending. American airstrikes had damaged Iranian infrastructure significantly. Oil depots in Tehran had been struck. Military bases had been degraded. Iran's conventional air force had been largely neutralized, but Iran's operational capacity remained. Its missile systems were firing. Its proxy networks were attacking. Its naval forces were contesting the strait. The hardened underground facilities that housed the most critical elements of Iran's strategic assets had survived the initial bombardment. Regime change, the original stated goal, was nowhere in sight. By day 18, the Gulf shipping crisis had grown into a full scale global economic emergency. Iran's strategy of using the strait as an economic weapon was functioning exactly as designed. Shipping insurance rates had reached levels that made most commercial voyages economically irrational. Major oil companies were announcing production disruptions. Fuel prices across Europe and Asia were climbing with a speed that governments were struggling to explain to their populations. The irony that Trump had initially denied the war had anything to do with oil, and then appeared to suggest that America would benefit from controlling oil, was not lost on the international community. It handed Iran a propaganda gift of incalculable value. Across the developing world, across the Middle East, and even within American allied nations, the narrative that this was a resource war began gaining traction. Iran exploited that narrative masterfully. By day 25, shipping through the strait had declined by nearly 90%. The global economy was absorbing a shock that threatened to tip several fragile, emerging market economies into crisis. Calls for ceasefire began emerging from unexpected quarters, not from adversaries of the United States, but from allies. By day 29, American aircraft losses had begun to mount in ways that the Pentagon's initial assessments had not fully anticipated. Iran's air defense systems, while degraded, had not been destroyed. They had been dispersed. Mobile launchers, concealed systems, and integrated networks that drew from decades of Russian and Chinese technical assistance were proving more resilient than the opening strike suggested. The shootdown of an F-15 on day 33 was not just a military event. It was a symbolic moment that Iran broadcast to the world as proof that American air superiority over Iranian territory was not absolute. And on day 35, Trump issued an ultimatum: reopen the strait within 48 hours, or face what he described only as hell. Iran's response was immediate, defiant, and chilling: the region will burn. The world was now staring into an abyss.
No major conflict in modern era unfolds in isolation, and Operation Epic Fury was no exception. The global response was a complex, fractured, and a mirror to the world shifting power alignments.
6. China watched with extraordinary attentiveness. As the largest importer of Gulf oil on Earth, China had an existential stake in the Strait of Hormuz crisis. The disruption of shipping had already begun cascading into Chinese industrial supply chains. Beijing issued careful diplomatic statements calling for restraint and dialogue, but behind the scenes, Chinese officials were making clear to both sides that a prolonged Hormuz shutdown was unacceptable to Beijing's economic interests. That pressure was real. Whether it would be decisive remained unclear. Russia, meanwhile, found itself in an ambiguous position. Elevated global oil prices benefited Moscow's sanctioned but still functioning petroleum exports. But a broader Middle Eastern conflagration created risks that threatened Russia's own regional interests and its ongoing complex relationship with Iran. Russian statements were measured, supportive of Iranian sovereignty in rhetorical terms, but carefully avoiding any commitment that would draw Moscow into direct confrontation with Washington. European governments were dealing with political crises of their own as fuel costs surged and populations demanded explanations. The traditional Atlantic alliance was showing strain. France, Germany, and others that had not been consulted before the operation began were navigating between loyalty to Washington and the political reality that their citizens were paying the price for a war they had no vote in. In the broader Middle East, the picture was even more complex. Saudi Arabia and the UAE had entered defensive postures, deeply alarmed by the expanding conflict on their doorstep and acutely vulnerable to both Iranian retaliation and Hormuz disruption. Israel, the co-initiator of the campaign, was managing its own northern front as proxy forces activated. The entire regional order was vibrating under the strain. The United Nations Security Council was paralyzed, as it almost always is in great power conflicts, by vetoes and competing interests. International law experts were issuing statements. Humanitarian organizations were warning about civilian casualties in Iran. None of it changed the battlefield. All of it shaped the narrative that Iran was winning in the court of global opinion.
36 days into the Operation Epic Fury, and Three broad futures are visible and none of them is comfortable.
7. The first is a negotiated settlement. The hints of talks, the shifting of Trump's war goals toward diplomacy, and the economic pressure of the Hormuz crisis all suggest that a negotiated off ramp is the most likely outcome in the medium term. But a negotiated settlement at this stage, given the scale of the military action and the stated goals of regime change, would represent an enormous strategic setback for American credibility in the region. Iran, having survived the assault, would emerge with its deterrent posture dramatically enhanced. Any deal that stops short of removing the Iranian government would be seen across the region as an Iranian victory, regardless of how it is packaged in Washington. The second future is further escalation. Trump's 48-hour ultimatum regarding Hormuz points in this direction. If Iran refuses to reopen the strait, and everything about their posture suggests they will refuse, the United States faces a choice between following through on the threat with even more destructive strikes, or allowing the ultimatum to expire without consequence. The first option risks a catastrophic widening of the conflict, potentially drawing in other regional actors and accelerating the economic damage to the global system. The second option would represent a humiliating climb down that would invite further Iranian aggression. The third future, the one that nobody wants to discuss publicly, is a prolonged, indeterminate war of attrition, a conflict that grinds on for months, perhaps longer, where neither side achieves its stated objectives, where the global economy absorbs damage that accumulates to crisis levels, where proxy networks keep American allies under continuous pressure, where the domestic political costs in both countries become unmanageable, but neither leadership can find an exit that doesn't look like defeat. This third future is, historically, the most common outcome of strategic traps. They don't end cleanly. They end with exhaustion, economic breakdown, and a negotiated reality that neither side would have accepted at the beginning, but that both are forced to accept at the end. 36 days. That is all it took for one of the most aggressively launched military campaigns in modern memory to arrive at a moment of profound strategic uncertainty. A war that was supposed to end in weeks has instead revealed something about the nature of power in the 21st century that should give every observer pause. Raw military force, the ability to rain destruction from the air, to project overwhelming firepower across thousands of miles, is no longer sufficient to achieve political objectives against a determined adversary that has spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of assault. Iran built its strategy not around winning the first battle, but around surviving it, around making the cost of continuation unbearable, around using the world's most critical energy choke point as a lever that no amount of air superiority can dislodge. The escalation trap is real, and the United States, for all its power, is inside it. The question now is not whether America can destroy more of Iran's infrastructure. It clearly can. The question is whether destruction translates into the political outcome that was promised when the first bombs fell on February 28th. 36 days of evidence suggests it does not. History will record this period as one of the most consequential turning points in 21st century geopolitics. The world that emerges from this conflict, however and whenever it ends, will be fundamentally different from the world that existed before day one. The balance of deterrence in the Middle East will have shifted. The reliability of American military guarantees will have been tested in the most public possible way. And Iran, whatever damage it has absorbed, will have demonstrated to every adversary of American power that the strategic trap is a viable weapon. 8.
The trap was set long before the first bomb fell. The question that history will ask is simple: why didn't anyone see it coming?